Hi, everyone. My name is Shanna Dobb, and I'm joining you from unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory today, colonially known as Vancouver, BC. In following that protocol, I want to link back to something that Angel Aluk said during the last panel, that Indigenous peoples have an inherent right to air, water, land, and natural resources, and that for a just transition to happen, we need to recognize and uphold Indigenous sovereignty. And in the first panel this morning, also, that was recognized and talking about the need to center Indigenous rights as a foundational and first commitment in all of our conversations and policy planning and advocacy around just transition. So thank you for that and for centering that in the conference conversation. I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives BC office and have co-directed the corporate mapping project that our office, together with the University of Victoria, the Parkland Institute, and the CCPA Saskatchewan office have jointly led over the past 7 years. Much of our work in the corporate mapping project has really hinged around what are the challenges and barriers to transforming Canada's energy economy, particularly fossil fuel industry corporate power, and the many ways, both obvious and subtle, that it shapes not only our economy and the climate itself, but also our understanding of public policy and what is possible and desirable for us as individuals, as workers, and communities as we confront the climate crisis. So I'm excited for the presentations and discussion we're going to have in this session, building on the excellent panels that we've already heard last night and earlier today. We'll start with Ian Hussey. Ian has been a colleague in the corporate mapping project over the last 7 years, and he began his work as a research manager at the University of Alberta Parkland Institute in 2014. As I say, he's been working with us through the whole life of the corporate mapping project as a key colleague. And Ian has conducted a wide range of research for Parkland, not just on the corporate mapping project related themes, which have included corporate restructuring and automation in the oil sands industry and Alberta's coal phase out, just transition, climate policy, but Ian's also looked at issues around minimum wage and Alberta fiscal matters. So over to you, Ian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ian Hussey. I'm a political economist at the Parkland Institute. I'd like to begin my remarks by respectfully acknowledging that I am joining you today from Edmonton, Alberta, and Treaty 6 territory, home to diverse Indigenous peoples for millennia. I also want to respectfully acknowledge Alberta's skilled trades workers in the energy industry, whose hard work and ingenuity have been keeping the lights on and our vehicles moving for decades. As the ongoing energy transition in Alberta and Canada and the world continue in the coming years and decades, it is vital that research organizations like Parkland Institute continue to work with and learn from Indigenous leaders and energy workers, so together we can understand and act on the challenges and opportunities involved in the energy transition. Energy is vital for our economy and society. The oil and gas industry are almost 10% of Canada's economy and almost 30% of Alberta's economy. The oil sands alone are responsible for 5% of Canada's GDP. It is also the case that about 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada are attributable to fossil fuel production, distribution, and use. As we move towards using less oil and gas and more hydroelectricity, wind and solar power, and more clean fuels like hydrogen, we must find ways to support workers and communities along that pathway. Here in Alberta, we know the energy industry is always changing and innovating. A lot of my research for the Parkland Institute has focused on the details of these changes, particularly how corporate restructuring and automation in the oil sands industry are affecting investment and employment. I was asked to focus my remarks today on my new research on oil sands automation. I also have a lot to say about the many new economic opportunities that are building momentum in Alberta, so please ask about that in the Q&A. Automation in the oil industry in Alberta and around the world has been advancing for over a decade. Automation was increasing before the 2014 oil price crash and has accelerated since 2014 as the big five oil sands companies strive to reduce their production costs. Global demand for oil will peak and start shrinking in the next decade, and oil companies know they must be cost competitive and carbon competitive in this business reality. When people think about automation in the oil sands, they often think about driverless haul trucks. And it's true, that hundreds of truck drivers in the oil sands mines have already lost their jobs, and many more hundreds will continue to lose their jobs because trucks are now being driven by advanced computers and software. But automation in the oil sands is mostly digitalization. Companies are investing in remote monitoring, mobile platforms, cloud computing, advanced analytics, and other related technologies to increase labor productivity and reduce costs. One recent study predicted that more than half of Canadian upstream oil and gas jobs could be eliminated by 2040 because of automation. In total, over 45,000 additional job losses are predicted just from upstream automation. These are jobs for heavy equipment operators, drilling and service workers, machinists, warehouse technicians, and many others. The industry is also starting to use technology to eliminate back office jobs in administration, finance, and human resources, where we might see more female employees than in the mines and in situ facilities. Oil and gas investment in Canada is down by 2/3 compared to the 2014 peak, and major producers are not increasing their investment with high oil and gas prices this year because they are transferring much of their considerable profits to shareholders and paying down their debt. In fact, the Alberta Energy Regulator forecasts that oil and gas capital investment will remain low throughout the 2020s. Yet oil sands production is expected to grow through efficiency gains from automation and some new in situ production. In situ production involves a lot of automation and is also GHG intensive. Another way of saying this is the large corporations that dominate the oil sands industry can now produce 1.7 million barrels per day with the same amount of labor that it took to produce 1 million barrels a day in 2011. So that's an extra 70% of production with the same amount of workers. Oil sands production growth has been decoupled from employment. So as production goes up, jobs are not going up as we produce more oil. As a result of these economic and technology trends, Alberta has 27,000 fewer oil and gas jobs now compared to 2014. And nationally, over 40,000 oil and gas jobs simply don't exist anymore. Failure to plan for and act on the ongoing energy transition is a major threat to Alberta workers, communities, and the economy. Turning briefly to new jobs and investment opportunities, I want to be clear there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic for Alberta's future. In fact, one recent study predicted that regardless of the path that Canada takes to reach net zero, Alberta's economy is expected to grow. So the sky is not falling. It's far from it, in fact. I just want to end by giving you some examples of current jobs as well as emerging sectors that will continue to grow as we get into the 2020s. So in energy-related fields, we'll start with one that many of you have heard of, and that is orphan well remediation. There are thousands of orphan oil and gas wells in Alberta, and they need to be remediated. And this will produce many job years of employment for oil service workers. Alberta's natural resource wealth includes minerals and metals, including lithium. And lithium for batteries will be a major opportunity for our economy and for Canada overall. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about hydrogen briefly. This is a topic of conversation for many people, but we don't often hear that Canada is a top 10 producer of hydrogen in the world. And in fact, we are the #1 producer of clean green hydrogen in the world. It's just that the world doesn't produce much green hydrogen or hydrogen overall, but actually Canada has a competitive advantage, both in green hydrogen and in hydrogen that comes from fossil fuels. And we need to take advantage of our early competitive advantage as the hydrogen economy takes off. And we've heard a lot today about renewable energy, but one thing that many experts speak about, and it doesn't often get to the public, is when we talk about renewable energy in Alberta and Canada, yes, we need to talk about wind and solar energy, and those are critical. But what may be more important in the near term is actually improving transmission connections between provinces. Almost all Canadian provinces actually export electricity to the United States. But in Alberta, we're one of the few Canadian provinces that does not export electricity to the United States. And there's far less transmission lines between provinces than we have from Canada to the US. So we need to increase transmission lines. And in Alberta, that would mean increasing transmission connections to BC to take advantage of BC's wealth of hydroelectricity. And that hydroelectricity would help us decarbonize our entire economy, including the 30% of our economy that is fossil fuel based. And the firm hydroelectricity would complement the intermittency of wind and solar. In Alberta, agriculture is a big deal, and we have plenty of opportunities to expand food manufacturing and also biofuel production. Canada is going through a process, it's been happening for many years, where our gasoline is actually blended with some biofuels, and the rate of that happening is supposed to be ratcheted up according to federal regulations. Also, in Alberta, for a brief period of time, when the NDP was in government, we had an energy efficiency program. Before that, we were the only state in North America that did not have a state-run energy efficiency program. And unfortunately, we've largely gone back to those days. But energy efficiency in new and existing buildings is a huge economic opportunity and could employ many thousands of workers in Alberta. The last energy-related area of growth that I'll mention is petrochemicals. The Alberta NDP government attracted new investment in petrochemicals, and the UCP has continued to build on their predecessor's program to some success. Earlier today, we heard a little bit about how the public sector can play a role in the energy transition. And I'd just like to add a couple additional ideas to complement comments made by my colleagues earlier. There is a very large need in Alberta and Canada for investment in K-12 education and in post-secondary education. And I believe unions in K-12 and post-secondary should be telling Canadians and Albertans about the value that they produce through education. Investing in education is an investment in current and future workers and communities and future business leaders. There's also increasing demand in Alberta and Canada for healthcare with an aging and growing population. And thirdly, the federal government is increasing investment in childcare, and this will be critical, as we heard in the panel in the morning, for enabling more women to participate in the labor force in a more formal and wholesome way. And that will actually expand our economy and increase consumer spending power in Alberta and Canada. There's also a great need for additional public infrastructure investment. So as we saw in our coal report, which I wrote with Emma Jackson a couple of years ago, there's a great need for local investment in infrastructure when we talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels. In this case, it was coal. There's also a great need for investment in adaptation and mitigation in the face of increasing climate instability. And we only need to look at the forest fires that happen seemingly every year in Alberta and BC and across the prairies, or the flooding that we saw in BC in the last year, to recognize that we need further investment in adaptation and mitigation. These are good construction jobs, they're good, well-paying jobs. Furthermore, in Alberta, we have very limited rail capacity, and this is always a bit strange for anyone who moves to Alberta, why there isn't basic rail connecting our cities and towns. Again, this can be a low carbon option, and it could lead to a lot of operational jobs as well as construction jobs in creating those new rail lines. And the last thing I'll mention is public transit, but perhaps not in the way that it's traditionally mentioned. Public transit is often talked about as replacing vehicles, passenger vehicles, and that is true, it does that. But one thing we need to think about in investing in public transit is actually making it more attractive for people who have certain preconceptions about public transit. And those can be very basic things, like improving lighting in stations and adding retail shops and restaurants to major transit hubs to make it a place where people want to go and use transit. I'll just end my remarks there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Ian. Lots of food for thought to follow up on there when we get to the Q&A and discussion portion. I'm going to turn things over to another colleague, a colleague at the CCPA National Office, Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood. He's a senior researcher with the CCPA, and his work focuses on the social and economic dimensions of Canada's shift towards a zero carbon economy, including the need for just transition. And he's done some really fantastic work and research in this area that he's going to give you just a little bit of a flavor of, but along with some of the reports that Ian was mentioning that he's done, I really encourage you to check out some of Hadrian's work, and all of that is available publicly through the Parkland and CCPA websites. So
thank you, Shannon, very kind. As you heard, Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, I'm joining you from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe land in what is also known as Ottawa. What I'm going to be talking about today is a tale of two transitions, is what I've called it. Parachutes and ladders is my lyrical title and metaphor. If that doesn't work for you, let me know. I'm trying it out. What I'm going to be talking about is bridging a little bit of what we've heard in the context of Alberta and the kind of on the ground reality of what do we do with these fossil fuel communities, but also what we heard this morning, which is successful examples from around the world of how you manage an energy transition and what that needs to look like in the Canadian context across the whole country, because a just transition does not only occur in the context of a fossil fuel phase out. That's one of the transitions, but the second one is the transition into clean energy. And although we often kind of conflate the two, there are different implications to both, and I'll get into that. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what do I mean by parachutes and ladders as two different kinds of policy tools and why we need both. But then I'm going to talk about specifically why the ladders are more important and how we've gotten it backwards in Canada. In other countries, they did ladders first, parachutes later. In Canada, we're doing parachutes first and then trying to catch up with the ladders. I'm going to talk about the geographic dimension here. So what does this actually look like? Provide some numbers across the country. And then I do want to touch on some of the equity dimensions here of who's left on the ground in this metaphor, and something the previous panel touched on, but I want to build on a little bit. So I'm going to start parachutes. These are policies, these are reactive just transition policies, and they're designed to minimize the harm of shifting out of fossil fuels. That's stuff like income support, retraining, pension bridging. This is usually what we hear about first when we talk about a just transition. Essentially, this is social policy. It's how do we build an expanded but targeted social safety net to support workers and communities affected by, in this case, the phase out of first coal power and then imminently oil and gas production. And this has to date been the focus of labor activism, not surprisingly, because its members are directly at risk here. But also government policy. This is, for example, Alberta's coal transition programs would fall in this category. In general, the idea here is that these parachutes are giving workers a soft landing out of fossil fuels. Workers, and then in some cases, their communities as well. But it's very focused on the shift out of fossil fuels. The problem is you can give someone a very generous parachute out of fossil fuels, and then what? You can give someone income support for a year, you can give them tuition credit, and then a year later, there's still no job in their community. And that's why we need ladders. We need proactive just transition policies that actually maximize the benefits of shifting into a clean economy. Ian just laid out several of them that in almost any scenario, any part of the world, including oil-dependent regions like Alberta, there are more benefits of moving into a clean economy than there are risks of moving out of fossil fuels. But we actually have to actively pursue those benefits. So that's things like green job creation and workforce development, which includes skills training. And this is more, now we're dabbling in industrial policy here. This is not just a social safety net. This is a bigger conversation about what economy we want to move into. It's also a lot more expensive, and that's why governments have shied away from it. But as we're going to discuss, it's necessary. So in my metaphor here, ladders are policies that help workers climb into the clean economy. How do they access good green jobs? And in some cases, how do we make those jobs in the first place? We need both sets of policies, to be clear. We need those parachutes to catch people falling through the cracks, catch people who can't move into this new economy. Pension bridging is a great example of a fantastic policy to help older workers who can't reasonably retrain. But I'm going to argue that the ladders are more important for two main reasons. The first is that, and this is where the metaphor starts to fall apart, but bear with me, if you have a big enough ladder, you don't need a parachute. That's what I'm saying. But what I mean by that is if you have adequate proactive investment in workforce development and job creation, then you can reduce the need for, and in fact, eliminate the need for a lot of reactive social policies. So Denmark's a great example of that. Denmark didn't need to have this kind of crisis just transition conversation where they're like, oh no, we lost all these jobs. What are we going to do now? Quick, let's try and scale up our wind industry. They did it the other way around. They scaled up wind first, trained people over years and decades, built out this whole ecosystem and infrastructure of an alternative economy, And that made the worker transition very easy. We're doing it the opposite way in Canada. We're phasing out first coal power, and then imminently and hopefully, because we need to, oil and gas. Once we've kind of lost those industries and we have all these unemployed workers and destitute communities, we're asking, okay, what alternatives should we invest in? And it's entirely backwards. Yes, we've kind of run out of time on phasing out fossil fuels, but we were also way behind in investing in alternatives. If we do the green job creation first, not only is the economic transition smoother, but it's just a way more politically palatable package. When you tell people, don't worry about transition, there's just different jobs in your community now. We haven't done that yet in Canada. But the second reason I think we need to focus on these ladder policies is just that we need a lot more ladders and parachutes in this metaphor. And that's because the job creation potential of the clean economy is way bigger than the job risk of phasing out fossil fuels. That's not only the case in Alberta. It's pretty close in Alberta, but in the rest of the country, it's very clear that there's a lot more opportunity in the clean economy than there ever was in fossil fuels. And we need to be growing that workforce aggressively because, first of all, we're dealing with very significant skill shortages in a lot of key industries, but also as an opportunity to diversify that workforce and build a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable economy in the long term. Just going to show you, this is probably data you're familiar with. The green bars here, this is the share of oil and gas jobs in provincial and territorial employment. There's different ways to measure this, but it gives you a good idea. Alberta is the leader with about 5% of direct employment in oil and gas, but again, different ways to measure it. And then Newfoundland, Labrador, Saskatchewan are also up there among the provinces. As you can see, the territories are actually quite dependent, often forgotten about in this conversation, even if the absolute number of jobs there is quite small. So these are the places, yes, we're going to need parachutes in these parts of the country. There are going to be people who need support in one way or another, and we need to give it to them. The ladders conversation is not an Alberta conversation exclusively. Yes, it's an Alberta conversation. It's also an everywhere conversation. These orange bars come from data recently published by the Conference Board of Canada, which shows a clean economy job forecast for 2030. And this is a very conservative assumption. They're not assuming kind of radical climate action, but under kind of any scenario, you're going to end up with kind of 3 to 5% of employment in every part of the country in new green jobs in the next 10 years. So who's going to do those jobs? This is a conversation we're not having. It's certainly not an appropriate scale for how we transition workers, we train workers, how we build out this workforce and make it productive, equitable, accessible in the long term. I'm just going to show the exact same data here. This is just in absolute terms. In absolute terms, Alberta far and away has the most oil and gas jobs, but clean economy jobs track a lot closer to population. Unsurprisingly, Ontario alone forecast to have about 500,000 new green jobs in the next 10 years. But even in Alberta, the numbers are pretty close. And as Ian just pointed out, in the long term, if you look beyond 10 years, the benefits to Alberta are also there. Even if in the next 10 years, it's going to be a little bit dicier. But the point is, we can't just be talking about parachutes. We need to be talking about ladders. We need to talk about what are the green jobs of the future and build towards that. I just want to touch a little bit on the equity piece here. And the last panel addressed this really well from a number of angles. So I just want to make a few points. The first is that one of the problems with focusing on these parachutes again is that when they're too targeted, when these transition policies are too narrow, they can actually make inequality worse. And this has been a real risk of the coal transition in Alberta and potentially for any future transition of oil and gas, where benefits are targeted very, very directly at full-time employees in certain facilities who happen to be overwhelmingly white Canadian-born men earning relatively high incomes. Now, to be clear, these workers deserve support. And that was something that was addressed this morning as well. We don't need to demonize these people for having good jobs in the fossil fuel industry. The problem is when you come in with government programs that only support those workers, and then everyone else in the community who's indirectly dependent on that industry, who's more likely to be a woman, more likely to be racialized, more likely to be an immigrant who doesn't have access to the same support, you can actually make inequality worse. One of the things we did in a lot of coal communities was say, okay, you just lost your 6-figure job. Here's $10,000 for training. Here's $5,000 to move to a different community. And then what happens to whoever's left behind? The same support wasn't offered to them. But we also need to think about this in the context of, again, ladders as an opportunity here. Because right now, marginalized groups, and you kind of define it any way you want, marginalization, marginalized groups are excluded from all of the key industries poised for growth in the clean economy. That's very clear in, for example, power generation and construction, which I'll show you in a second. And unless we proactively try and change those trends, a lot of the people who benefit from all this new job creation are going to be the same white Canadian-born men. As a white Canadian-born man myself, I'm not trying to demonize these workers. They should have as much opportunity as anyone in the clean economy, but they shouldn't be the only ones who have access to these opportunities. About workforce development, diversification, the more we invest in proactive job creation and training, the less we need to worry about those parachute policies. I'm just going to show you some. This is a little bit outdated data from the 2016 census, so we'll have new numbers shortly. But this just shows the breakdown of different groups in the economy. So women are about 48% of the labor force, Indigenous people about 4%, racialized people 21%, and immigrants about 23%. Again, this is about 5 years old. That's their share of the overall workforce in Canada. But if we look at two industries that are poised for growth, which is A, power generation, in orange there, and B, construction in yellow, you can see that all these groups are significantly underrepresented. And that means if we make these big investments in, for example, Ian listed a bunch of these high potential industries, from biofuels to green hydrogen or whatever, those benefits are not going to go to mostly to marginalized people in this country. So we can do a much better job of building ladders that are targeted at those groups to give them access to these benefits. Again, just the takeaways here, I think we're talking about two transitions, so let's be clear about that. They overlap, but the transition out of fossil fuels and the transition into a clean economy occur in different geographies and often with different groups of people. Parachutes are policies that offer fossil fuel workers and communities a soft landing out of fossil fuels, but on their own do not ensure green jobs either for those communities or for workers across the country. And that's why we need ladder policies that create green jobs and increase access to those jobs across the country. And the more that we prioritize these ladder policies, the easier it gets to manage the kind of negative transition out of fossil fuels. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm pleased to now introduce Laurie Thorkelson, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta, along with Melanie Thomas. She is the co-PI of the Future Energy Systems Project, Assessing Political Pathways of Energy Transition, which examines the decarbonization backlash. And I look forward to hearing from you now, Laurie.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Like Ian, I am joining you today from Edmonton, which I respectfully acknowledge is located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. Well, this has been fantastic to listen to Ian and Hadrian's comments. I'm going to jump into this discussion by talking about the work that my team and I have been doing on attitudes towards energy transition. And so this comes in with another element of the equation, which has to do with how we talk about what's going on in energy transition and how this matters. By now in the day, we're probably pretty familiar with the energy transition. I'll start with an observation of how energy transition is sometimes characterized. Some colleagues in political science who've called it technically feasible, but politically impossible. So we have the tools, we have the technology, and we could radically reduce our emissions, but it's very politically difficult to do this. And we know that it's due to entrenched interests. And I want to dig in and look a little bit at some of these attitudes that make change so difficult and try to figure out if there are this points to some ways forward. And when we talk about energy transition, we are talking about the transition to a low carbon economy. And we're talking about two different shifts. So we're talking about both a shift away from fossil fuels and a shift toward lower carbon sources of energy. And so a shift toward renewables. And in our research, we try to separate these two to try to understand how people think about these two different shifts in different ways. On the screen, you can see just a headline, a Guardian article from a few months ago. And this is about a McKinsey report that had been released in which they estimated that the type of transformation required for an energy transition would require about $9.2 trillion worth of investment. And so I put that up here because I wanted to underscore just the scale of the change that we're talking about. That energy transition really represents a fundamental transformation. It is a transformation of the economy. It is a transformation of our energy systems, but it is also one that will involve deep change politically, societally, culturally. And so really, I think of it as change that's on par with the Industrial Revolution in terms of the transformations that it will bring. And so for me as a political scientist, this means that I'm very interested in looking at how it has the potential to shape our politics and shape lines of political division and what to expect from this. Just to give us a picture of the task at hand for Canada, I have this graph of greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. A little bit old, the data is from 2019, but what we can see from this is that there are two sectors that in 2019 at least accounted for over half of Canada's emissions, and that is oil and gas and transport. And so those two sectors alone are a whopping amount for Canada, certainly not the only contributors to our greenhouse gas emissions, but very important. And then if we look at where these emissions are coming from, we can see that the province of Alberta is pretty deeply implicated here, and that it has the largest greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. If we were looking at a graph that were representing these emissions per capita, we would see both Alberta and Saskatchewan high above the others. We'd see Ontario's bars shrink because of their population. If we were looking at a graph which was showing us how we stacked up against other countries, we would see that Alberta and Saskatchewan, if they were countries, were right at the higher end of high emissions countries. And so what this means is that for Alberta, there's an enormous task ahead. It's a fossil fuel intensive economy. And that means that it is an especially important task for Alberta, and also an especially challenging one. For Alberta, because the fossil fuel industry is so important to the economy, and then we saw in Hadrian's slides the employment in Alberta that depends on the fossil fuel industry, then we can understand that energy transition, or this issue, is cueing a couple of threats. And so one of the threats that it cues for people is climate change. We're afraid of the consequences of climate change, so we need to act. But then there's another threat that, especially in Alberta, comes into play, and that is the fear of the implications that it could have for our economy. And we see this in some of the elite messaging around energy transition and about the fossil fuel industry. And so the elite message, I think, can be reasonably interpreted as energy transition is an existential threat to Alberta because it is an existential threat to oil. So I've got on the slide here a recent tweet by Jason Kenney, in which he says, "When our key industry is attacked, we will fight back. Alberta's oil and gas is critical for Canada's recovery and our long-term prosperity. 800,000 workers rely on it to put food on their tables. We will always stand up for our energy workers." And then a social media post by the Canadian Energy Centre, sometimes known colloquially as the War Room, that emphasizes the economic contribution that Alberta's oil and gas industry makes. And so this is the message coming from Alberta's government, strongly in defense of the industry and also highlighting the economic contributions. But how many Albertans actually see it this way? So how do Albertans see energy transition as this existential threat against them, their province? This is what we were interested in our research. And so together with my research team, and I work with Melanie Thomas at the University of Calgary, and along with others, Nikita Slepkov, Brooks DeCelia, Christian Schimpf, and John Santos, we conducted immediately after the 2019 provincial election, we conducted a survey experiment with just over 2,600 Albertans. We were interested in finding out not only how people felt about moving away from fossil fuels, how people felt about moving toward renewables, how various demographic factors, as well as their different values, affected these attitudes. And we were also interested in seeing whether or not these attitudes were malleable. And so could they be influenced? And so in this, we embedded some survey experiments, and we wanted to test the impact of messaging on their attitudes. So we had people listen to 2 clips of quite realistic radio news articles. So these were based on actual CBC news articles. One was about the potential economic contributions that would come from a large solar installation. The second was a story of the economic hardship following decline of a coal town in Alberta. This is some of what we found. First of all, one of the things that we wanted to measure was a sense of the hopefulness of Albertans in the future of oil and gas and for the economy in Alberta. 18% of respondents told us that Alberta's economy is too dependent on oil and gas. And so this is tapping a sense of an economic downside of continuing to have an oil and gas-centered economy. 46% told us that 25 years from now, they expected that oil and gas will still be Alberta's most important industry. More than 50% disagreed with that statement. And so this is already a sign that Albertans, the majority of Albertans, looking ahead to the future in which we have an energy transition away from oil and gas. We measured energy transition, support for energy transition, with a battery of different questions. 87% of respondents agreed that Alberta should move towards renewable sources of energy. So there's a quite very strong degree of support amongst our survey respondents that we should move towards and invest in renewable sources of energy. Also 70% agreeing with the statement that we should restructure our economy to slow down the effects of climate change. There is some variation as well. Nearly half of respondents also believe that we should expand our oil and gas industry, and over half, 53%, still worried that our economy would suffer in Alberta if we moved away from fossil fuels. 60% agreeing, though, that we should move away from oil and gas. 66% concerned that we would miss out on some future economic benefits if we did not transition to wind and solar and invest in wind and solar. So we've got a really mixed bag here. And another interesting one, 68% reporting, I am proud of Alberta's oil and gas industry. And I'll come back to that one in a minute because it plays an interesting role here. We also asked respondents who should be responsible for an energy transition, because this has implications for what political pathways are open to you. So you might be open to it, fundamentally disagree with government taking a large role in these things. We found that overall, the strongest support for action was in support of the provincial government taking a leading role in energy transition. This was supported by those who worry about climate change and they believe it's human caused. NDP supporters tended to agree with, get behind the provincial government taking action. Economic conservatives and populists did not support this option. They were more strongly in favor of regular people, so not government taking action here. The federal government was also a top choice for those who were generally worried about climate change. One of the last choices for those who were economic conservatives, populists, and not surprisingly, those who identified with Alberta Proud values as well. And in terms of industry taking a leading role, women, suburban respondents, and economic conservatives were most likely to rank industry taking action as their top choice. And so putting this all together, and what does this mean? Overall, we found in our survey that belief and worry about climate change matters, but our attitudes toward the economy and future of oil and gas matter more. And interestingly, beliefs about the future of oil and gas, when we asked people whether they thought that it would be the most important industry in 25 years, their answer on that was more important in predicting their support for energy transition or their opposition to energy transition than whether they actually worked in the industry. And so it's this pride in the industry and hope in the future of it that seems to be playing an important role shaping people's attitudes. Some of the most consistent economic effects came from economic conservatives. So people who identified as being economically conservative, so they agreed with statements that government should take a minimal role in the economy, were most likely to be opposed to energy transition. Interestingly, people who identified as more socially conservative were more supportive of, for example, solar power, less likely so to be supportive of wind power, politics and other belief systems. And so values partisanship here trump climate beliefs. And finally, when we were looking at the impact of whether or not we could change people's attitudes by playing them these clips, by giving them a message that either give them a message of potential economic benefits from the development of solar installations, or exposing them to a story of the economic hardships resulting from the transition away from coal, we found that some of their opinions are malleable. The effects were pretty small, which is on par with what other research finds on the impacts of these types of queuing effects. But in general, exposure to these messages tended to increase people's support for energy transition. Now, this didn't surprise us for our treatment on the economic benefits of the solar investments, because that was pretty much what we were expecting. We were a little bit surprised to discover that this effect also held for the story of the decline of the coal town. And we thought that perhaps this might be explained by the fact that people maybe have different attitudes about coal than they do about oil and gas, and tend not to identify with it, be proud of coal the way that people may be proud about oil and gas, or have economic hopes about it. Or another explanation might be that that story really served another purpose, and that it really served to underscore the reality of energy transition and the fact that this is happening and it has consequences, and perhaps prompting people to be more supportive of a proactive measure to make a transition. In sum, what this tells us is that, first of all, there is more of an appetite for energy transition among the Albertan public than current events or our elite discourse would suggest. And secondly, overcoming opposition to energy transition really comes down to moving opinion on our beliefs about the future of the economy. And so I think it really comes down to answering this question of what is the growth story of the 21st century? Thank you.
Thank you, all three of Laurie, Ian, Adrian. Lots to talk about here. I'm just going to start by looping back to something that Ian said around some of the trends in investment and jobs. And it just strikes me across the presentations and in going back to what Ian was saying, how so much of the conversation about climate and about just transition have been driven by or constrained by these kind of apparent catch-22 sort of framing of the issues. I mean, one of the key sets of arguments that industry and its allies deploy is essentially, yes, we might like to take action, or yes, we should take action to some degree, but not too quickly or not too radically, because, we have to be careful. Jobs, the economy, jobs, the economy. And in kind of similar public opinion research that we've done in BC, find that the headline sort of statements about jobs and the economy tend to trump any of those other beliefs, even the beliefs of the very climate concerned, who tend to be more committed to climate action policies. And I'm just so struck always by the contrast between that and the reality that, as Ian talked about, particularly in the time of unconventionals, we've seen ever-growing production in spite of tremendous crash in oil prices that began in 2014. That we've seen the declining contributions of the oil and gas sector to GDP, to jobs and employment, to federal and provincial revenues, where and the trend line in production is going in the opposite direction. It certainly hasn't been climate action, and it's not right now climate action that is driving the disruption or job loss or insecurity that people are experiencing in and around these industries. It's the automation, it's the rise of unconventionals, it's the drive to increase productivity and control labor costs, it's global oil prices, it's everything but climate action, really, for the most part, with the partial exception of coal. All of you offer some really important guidance around how we try to find our way out of those kind of false dichotomies or that catch-22 that just always we end up coming back to, and that still, drives so much of the public conversation and our culture around climate policy and action.
I think that you raised some really important issues, and it really made me think about the role of this narrative of environment versus economy as a dichotomy, as a trade-off. That's been the central narrative of opposition to climate policy that came from industry and their lobbyists for quite a long time. And then we saw in the UK in 2006, we saw the Stern Review on the economics of climate change. And so Nicholas Stern is a former chief economist of the World Bank, and the UK government had commissioned him to write a report. And this report looked into the costs of not acting on climate change. For the very first time, it quantified the costs that we would face if we just sat back and did nothing. And so I think it really altered that conversation. And we're starting to see, I think, quite a lot of shifts. So looking at the work that Mark Carney has done on warning of the economic possible looming catastrophes of stranded assets, for instance. And so it really turns that dichotomy on its head. And I think that it is really important, and it gets us thinking about our economic futures in a different way, and breaking away from this false dichotomy of economic growth versus climate action.
I'll just add one thing to that, because I think it's a great point that it's not like we can just keep doing what we're doing and there's no cost to that. Essentially, an inevitable transition, and really what we're debating on is how well we want to manage it versus being thrown into it, I think is important. To use Laurie's very excellent phrase, is that the growth story of the 21st century? I don't know. That's not a hopeful message, but it's important context. Jim Stanford, who a lot of us have worked with, wrote a great report that broke down, like, what are the actual job risks to the oil and gas industry in this transition. And they're actually a lot smaller than the narrative would suggest, because like it often gets framed as we're going to shut down oil and gas production and then there's going to be 100,000 people out of work. But that's not actually what's on the table here. In the same way that we phased out coal with an extended timeline, and this is something that Grace and Sarah pointed out this morning, if we were to set a timeline for oil and gas phase out of whatever, 2040 or 2050, then almost everyone who loses a job will just retire in that time. Like, there aren't actually going to be big layoffs. It's just going to be the natural process of attrition as those projects wind down. The key point here is we can either manage the transition where you don't actually have a lot of unforeseen job loss, or you can just say, we're going to plow ahead until whatever, oil prices crater or a government changes its mind or whatever. And then you're going to see a huge amount of disruption. But if we actually plan it and manage it, we don't have to experience the hardship that a lot of people are worried about.
Here, the politics does something a little weird. When we look at our data, it's not the people who work in oil and gas who are the most concerned and also opposed. It's the ones who identify with oil and gas. And so we've, in follow-up research, we've been starting to measure identification with the industry. And so the pride that people feel in it, whether or not they feel personally attacked if someone from Hollywood comes along and denigrates their industry. And so it's these emotions of pride in it and defensive-ness, fear, and which is quite separate from these objective economic evaluations of how many people will be affected, or, we can quantify how they might be affected, and then developing a strategy based on that, because the political reaction to the threat really turns it into something much different, and I think bigger and also more potent as a force of opposition to change.
I think in Alberta, one of the things we need to do is improve energy and climate literacy. I think a lot of people think that, unlike our discussion here in this panel, that fossil fuels are simply going to be replaced by renewables, and it's just a matter of switching them, and it's not going to be a big deal. But this is patently false. And people have not been told, let alone engaged in a conversation where they can contribute their knowledge about what the energy transition actually means. In Alberta, one of the ways we talk about this is net zero doesn't necessarily mean phasing out oil and gas entirely. It doesn't mean getting rid of our energy industry. It doesn't mean getting rid of energy jobs. And it doesn't mean that many people can't live in rural Alberta and have good employment. There are a number of things that need to be put into the public conversation that I genuinely believe are just not part of it. For one thing, in Canada, we tend to talk about electricity as simply a provincial matter, and we produce our own electricity in Canada because it is provincial jurisdiction. And in Alberta, we care about provincial jurisdiction greatly, but we don't talk about how we could be trading electricity between provinces, which is one of the major points so many expert studies say about Canada is in Alberta, one of the quickest ways to help us decarbonize our economy is to take advantage of increased transmission lines to BC to take advantage of BC's 99% hydroelectricity. Because the reality is in Alberta, by 2025, about 75% of our electricity will be from burning natural gas. And if we're to get to net zero, we need to reduce that greatly from 2025 to 2050. And that's not going to be a simple matter. Some of those gas plants are brand new, and some of them are converted coal plants, which are going to be decommissioned at their natural end of life as a facility. Beyond that, we tend to have a very polarizing debate. And unfortunately, that means that often our debate is not based in science and facts, both political and economic. Some of those things relate to hydrogen, where some people believe hydrogen is a threat to oil and gas, and that's not actually true. The largest producer and consumer of hydrogen in Canada is Suncor Energy. Suncor Energy is the third largest oil company in Canada. And I was surprised to find out from a recent International Energy Agency report that Canada is the largest producer of clean, green hydrogen in the world. And we're simply not talking about these things. And I think that's a big part of the issue, is it's not a pitting of economy versus the environment. There are so many balls in the air, and the energy transition is so much more complicated than what we're actually talking about, that we tend to divide it into for and against, jobs versus the economy, Alberta versus Canada and the world. And, none of these things are actually true. And that's a big part of public opinion. It's a big part of political dynamics in Alberta. And so that climate and energy literacy really needs to improve. And that's where an organization like Parkland at the University of Alberta really sees where we need to contribute to those discussions publicly.
Maybe I'll just follow up your comment about interprovincial electricity. One of the big challenges in BC is reliance on large hydroelectric projects, which many progressive energy analysts, including my own organization, have in the past tended to generally favor, but that we have really failed to understand and recognize the very disruptive dispossession and environmental Indigenous land dispossession and rights violations that go with those projects and the environmental damage that they cause. But, there are so many additional avenues for us to go in terms of renewable electricity generation. It's interesting that one of the reasons that BC has and will have an ample supply of energy in the coming years is because of the Site C dam, which is hugely problematic for the reasons I just mentioned in BC for building out a really unneeded amount of hydroelectric capacity. It's a giant subsidy and enabling structure for growth in fracking. It's about getting transmission lines out into the fracking fields in the northeast of the province to power very damaging and rights violating fracking projects to fuel an LNG export industry that is planned in this province. And it would be much more helpful, even with all the caveats around Site C, to be looking at how we could put that energy to better use. It should be used in the transition instead of as part of a sort of greenwashing of fracking as it currently is, in an effort to be able to claim that BC natural gas and LNG is clean or the cleanest in the world, which is so much BS, as it were. So I want to take one of the questions to start from the Q&A. Paul asks, why do so many economic studies show that the energy transition will result in lower GDP globally if there are more jobs and more investment needed with energy transition than the status quo energy system?
I got a couple thoughts on that. One is that, it depends on the study, because there are definitely studies that find the opposite. But I think even there was one report that was published last month, which maybe you're referring to, and it did find by 2050, we might see GDP depressed by something like 2%. It's important that the next line is that it actually recovers and exceeds that by the end of the century, because the alternative, as Laurie explained, is a status quo of climate crisis that gets exponentially more expensive. So we do need to do this regardless. The reason you'd see depressed GDP is essentially it's economically inefficient to stop using infrastructure you've already built. Like winding down coal plants that still work is not economically efficient, even if it's absolutely necessary environmentally. But the other point I would make is that even with lower GDP, we can still be better off. It's a question of distribution. And so one of the challenges, and this is something that has been brought up at this conference, is that often the renewable jobs that can replace oil and gas jobs are not as high income, but you employ a lot more people. So the social well-being is improved, but you can still see like costs in certain parts of the economy, especially for high income people, for the oil and gas industry, for example. But let's be skeptical of GDP being the only indicator of us actually making a productive and sustainable and inclusive transition.
I like to focus, instead of global studies, which I'm not sure which studies are being referenced here, but I like to focus on Alberta and Canadian studies because I work in Alberta. My focus is here. According to a study last year from the University of Calgary, regardless of the path Alberta takes to net zero, our economy will grow. That's even if we dramatically decline our fossil fuel production in the next 15 years. So once again, for Alberta, I can't speak about the world. For Alberta, the sky is not falling. There are incredible opportunities for us. And it's very unlikely, of course, that we're going to dramatically, like through regulation, reduce oil and gas production in the next 15 years. But the point is, even if that does happen, other sectors of our economy will grow, and perhaps they will grow faster, and we will have more resilience and diversity in our economy than if the fossil fuel industry continues to be 30% of our economy. But the sky's not falling. We're not going to lose all our jobs. We're not going to lose all our investment. That's simply not true, according to any number of economic models that are focused on Alberta and Canada. So I don't like these scare tactics of often they come from the right wing, but this is not based in the best economic and scientific information we have. And quite frankly, I don't find it helpful. I think in Alberta, there are a great number of opportunities that are just taking off, and some of which need more attention. But it is also the case that the oil and gas industry will continue to be part of our economy for quite a long time. And the question is, how much do Albertans as workers and communities benefit from that versus shareholders who, for the major oil companies, are largely not based in Canada, in fact. So that's really the political dynamic for me. And it doesn't have to do with our economy cratering, because I haven't seen any study that says Alberta's economy is just going to, fall in a hole in the ground.
I was just going to jump in to say, to note that that McKinsey study that I had shown in my slide, it predicts a J-shaped curve. And so there's some hardship before greater growth. And I think it's also important not to shy away from acknowledging that and to have these frank conversations and not pretend that it's going to be clear sailing, because there will be losses, and losses will fall on some people and not others. They'll be uneven. And I think that if we do not start having serious and open and public policy discussions about this, then it can, I think, potentially trigger some quite divisive and harmful politics. And I think that takes us away from the most effective policy solutions.
Shout out to Gil McGowan last night. It was his first point was we need to be honest about this transition. Yes, there are going to be costs. Yes, it's going to be better in the long term, but let's not shy away from what those costs are.
That's absolutely a really important foundational ethic in climate communication and in this whole conversation. There's a question in the Q&A pointing out a worry about, given the recent protests and occupation in Ottawa, are there risks of similar kind of right-wing reaction in response to climate action or energy transition? And I mean, I would maybe add to that, but to some extent, that's what that is. That's what we were seeing in part. There were lots of things happening there, but I actually think that a key piece of it is partly, going back to Kat's really insightful comments last night about the politics of insecurity and fear and, the various threats that people perceive or may be perceiving, including to ways of life and to different industries or to their communities. When we've seen the very active fomenting, it's interesting what you talked about, Lori, around the power of the identification with industry, that when people, regardless of whether, I believe if I understood what you said, that whether or not they work in the industry, that that's not the driver of that identification, that the identification itself, pride or defensiveness about the industry, that kind of trumps everything else in terms of beliefs and attitudes about climate. This very toxic rhetoric that's been promoted, some of our colleagues in the Corporate Mapping Project have called it petropopulism, of really fomenting and encouraging that kind of identification and the sort of fear-based and anger-based sense of being under attack that goes with that. And it does strike me that, that comment Kat made last night about insecurity is really key, and that a piece of this is around building an agenda and a narrative that speaks to security, but in a very positive way, that isn't pretending that there aren't these sort of costs or risks, at all, but that tries to move beyond some of that very ugly and divisive kind of rhetoric that we've seen. Maybe you could comment a little more, Lori, about what we're seeing in the current moment, and how that, a bit more about how that identification that you talked about is working for people and in the conversation.
I think it helps if we understand energy transition as this major structural transformation. And so it triggers a different type of politics. And so the politics of reaction that we're seeing is resistance against threat. And so fear is very powerful in politics and political movements. And so people are very loss averse, and we push back against threats. And so it's a status threat. It's not just about some policy question of should we just change our mix and our grid from here to here. It gets translated into a politics of attack against who we think and believe we are. And so one of the questions that we ask in our battery of questions to tap into an oil and gas identity is one where, without oil and gas, life just wouldn't be the same around here. And so it's that feeling of threat against loss of that type of life. I mean, and even if we look at Russia's war with Ukraine and some of the rhetoric that's been flowing around that, you can even see climate change coming into that, and climate change being seen as an attack against Russia, these climate change policies that are threatening to harm this fossil fuel centered economy of Russia. And so it's extends even to there. So it is, I think, potentially a very powerful, potent political force.
I think we need to expand the conversation beyond just oil and gas and it being replaced by wind and solar. I mean, people who work on these things understand that wind and solar in Canada have grown a lot in recent years, but they're actually a very small part of our electricity system. And so we're speaking about these things in very simplified terms, and we just need to expand those, because the energy transition is going to be complex, it's going to be nuanced, and it's not going to be linear. In Alberta, like I said, we're going to have 75% of our electricity coming from natural gas by 2025. Not only do we need to phase that out over time, we need to triple our electricity capacity. When you talk about jobs and investment, that is a lot of jobs and investment. It's a question of, in Alberta, most of our electricity actually comes from private providers, businesses, but there are public utilities as well. And both the private and public sector and the utility sector in Alberta are going to be critical and will expand. There's complications, I understand, with hydroelectricity to do with Indigenous sovereignty and many other things, which are very important topics, and we can't get into it today in the detail, but I do appreciate Shannon making those comments. I'm just simply saying, based on expert reports that don't get to the public, one of the main things any number of authors who might not agree on a lot agree on is we need more interprovincial ties for electricity. And in the short term, that is going to help to decarbonize the oil and gas sector. And I understand people have issues with that, but Alberta absolutely needs to increase its electricity trade with its neighbors, specifically BC. That is critical to our overall economic decarbonization for our entire economy. And eventually, if the federal government does not regulate the oil and gas industry out of existence. I doubt a provincial government's going to do it. What is more important for reducing demand for Albertan oil and gas is actually climate action elsewhere in the world, specifically the US. Everyone knows most of our oil is sold to the US. Much of our gas is sold there as well, although that is decreasing with more fracking happening in the US. And so, yes, our federal government and our provincial governments are putting us on a pathway to net zero. But what we're not talking about is, in fact, the bigger issue for Alberta, as far as the demand for our main exports, is actually US policy and US economics. And specifically, it's not just climate policy, it's the advancement of electric vehicles. And that's why I said, you know, Alberta has a lot of lithium and other metals and minerals that will be critical in the economies that are emerging. And we need to talk about those more. We need to promote those businesses. We need to support those entrepreneurs in Alberta. So it's not just this negative, we're phasing out oil and gas or we're reducing oil and gas, because there are all kinds of other things that are positive outside of oil and gas, but there are also things that need to happen within oil and gas to reduce the GHG impact of the oil and gas sector itself, which we haven't spoken about yet today.
I think the answer here, I mean, this is from my own perspective, working mainly on federal policy, is like, let's not wait, let's start the transition. And so our good friend Seth Klein has argued that we should just be setting up crown corporations that are investing in these alternatives. And I've made a similar argument. Like, if we just go into a place like Alberta with could be a federal crown corporation, better if it was provincial, but if it was federal, it's like, we're throwing down $5 to $10 billion a year to scale up alternative energy sources in this province. Guess what? We're hiring thousands of people these are going to be good jobs. Then we don't even need to have a transition conversation. People are just going to say, oh, great, there's good jobs in my community. So I know it's more complicated than that, but we can't wait, certainly as public institutions. Lead with big public money, and then the rest of this is going to be a lot easier.
Thank you so much, Lori and Hadrian and Ian, for sharing your thoughts and research and comments. I know thanks to folks who were putting questions in the Q&A, and we could keep going clearly for quite a while and continue to have an excellent further conversation. We're out of time, so we'll wrap up. And a further thanks to the Parkland Institute for organizing this conference. It's just been excellent all day. Thank you.